It's a great pleasure to be here. And obviously there isn't a tremendous amount of time. What I'd like to do is to take two or three themes from Temple and to offer some kind of, because of the time, rather limited defense of some of his most distinctive positions, particularly as set out in Christianity and the Social Order, and also in his pamphlet written very near his death, What Christians Stand For in the Secular World. Now, Temple was as clear as anybody that you couldn't, as a Christian, assume in Britain of the time, and it's even more obvious since, you couldn't just assume that Christianity was a kind of shared set of moral beliefs and metaphysical beliefs that somehow could provide a narrative that held society together. There are far too many differences between people, far too many forms of, what he called alienation in the world for that to be possible. But he did think there was a way of trying to bridge the gap between Christians and those who didn't hold to the Christian narrative. And important in that context is the idea of natural law, which he came to warm towards, particularly near the end of his life. And I want to say a few words about that slightly later in this talk. What he concentrates on in chapter 5 of the Christianity and the Social Order is the idea of freedom. And of course this is an idea which has assumed even greater salience perhaps in the modern world as opposed to the world of the 1940s. But what he tries to make very clear is that while as he says, freedom is the goal of politics, that's the beginning of chapter 5, while freedom is the goal of politics, we need to be clear what freedom means. And this brings him into a kind of critique of the idea of individualism, because often people who are arguing about freedom want to talk about individual freedom, whereas for Temple, it can't just be individual freedom, because individuals only have the identity that they have, the character that they only have the values that they have, and so forth, through being acculturated in institutions, family, school, church, civil society organizations, and all of that. And individuals, what he wants to say is that we should not talk about freedom of the individual. We should talk about freedom of persons. And a person is not reducible to the idea of individualism as that idea is deployed particularly by liberal political thinkers. Rather, once you focus on the idea of a person, you bring with that idea some conception of the sort of, if you like, the infrastructure of common beliefs, the shared ways of being brought up and coming to live the life that you live and so forth. You don't get that with the idea of individualism. Freedom of the individual in liberal political thought tends to mean freedom from coercion, and that's all that it is. But it does mean, it has big ramifications, this idea of freedom from coercion, because it does mean that there is no basis for a critique of the choices that people actually make. This is made very clear, for example, by Isaiah Berlin in his 4 essays on liberty, that it's not feasible in a liberal society to provide a critique of the choices that people make. What gives people importance and dignity is the fact that they can make choices. It's not the choices that they make. They have to be accepted as a kind of given, and that because of that, unless those choices in practice interfere with the choices that others make, then they just have to be accepted, however deplorable or whatever else you might think those choices are. So, why is freedom of the individual, why is freedom as the absence of coercion not sufficient for Temple? Well, one argument that in a sense is implicit in what he argues, but it can be made much more explicit, is this, that freedom of the individual cannot exist, almost for logical reasons, without shared values. And the reason why that follows is that if you say that a person who is coerced is not free, then we have to have some idea of what coercion means. What is coercion? Well, you might say it's obvious what coercion is. It's when somebody prevents you from doing what you want to do. But the law doesn't usually operate through coercion. The law operates through threats. If you do this, you'll go to jail, or if you do that, you'll have to pay a fine. The law operates fundamentally in relation to threats. And yet something is only a threat against something that you find valuable. You can't say that all threats are coercive. They can only be threats if they threaten something that you value. And Temple took the view that in order to understand what coercion is, we have to have some idea of the values that people share, such that we all recognize that a threat to those values is indeed a form of coercion. So you can't sort of say, almost from the start of trying to defend the idea of liberty of the individual, you can't say that we don't have to have shared values. You can only have liberty in relation to the law if you have shared values, because the law will then seek to prevent threats to those shared values. Now, you might think this is all terribly abstract and so forth, but just think about the issue of what's come to be called minority legal orders, where different religious groups are now claiming the right, as it were, to regulate their group life by utilising some kind of legal order that's sanctioned by their belief system. They will have a wider view of what a threat is, because their range of common values is wider than that prevails in society generally. So even in a sort of practical thing, should we sort of condone Sharia law? Should we condone things like the regulation of the Jewish community through the Beth Din and so forth? Well, you could say these are shared values amongst those communities. And in sharing those values, they have a different conception of what a threat is. Compared with the rest of society. So it doesn't invalidate Temple's point. In a sense, it's an endorsement of it, that there can only be freedom in relation to the law in the context of shared values. Now, of course, the problem then arises, well, let's accept that for the moment, that there are these shared values as the basis of law and helping us to understand what a threat is. But Temple wants to go much further than that. He wants to say not only must there be common values so that we share a common idea of a threat, but also that those values must be given some basic legitimacy. And they're given that legitimacy through the idea of natural law, or as he sometimes calls it, the natural order. That there are values that we hold, which then define what a threat is. There are values that we hold which are underpinned by the idea of natural law as Temple sees it. Now, what do we make of the idea of natural law? Well, he says that the natural law arises from thinking about what would be the kind of stopping place of any kind of argument about what we should do. So, for example, if you say to me, why are you doing that? I might say, well, I'm doing it because of so-and-so. Well, why are you doing it because of so-and-so? Well, because of such and such. And eventually, you have to end up with some basis for your argument, some stopping point in the argument. Let's say, well, if I don't do it, I will die. And that is as good a stopping point as any. But there are also lots of other stopping points. And natural law is, for Temple, about those basic values that provide justification for what we do and, as it were, stopping points for arguments about what we should do. And in Temple's view, these values, which can be accepted by, indeed are accepted by, because they're part and parcel of ordinary daily life, this kind of argument, that those values are accepted by Christians, but also by others. And what we have to do in order to provide a bridge between Christians and the rest of the community, which he says in the book are sometimes seen as alien, that this idea of natural law provides a bridge between the non-Christian community and the Christian community because we share common reasons for justifying our actions, and that those have to be brought out and acknowledged as common reasons, common beliefs. Now, for the Christian, these beliefs are, as it were, justified by belief in God. For the non-Christian, they're not. They're just part of how society works, that we have to acknowledge these basic values, because without those basic values, we wouldn't share a common basis for thinking about what a threat is. And if we haven't got a common basis for thinking about what a threat is, we don't have a common basis for law either. Now, of course, one of the things that's happened since Temple's day is that we perhaps can't assume that natural law values can be legitimated by religion, but I can't really go into that in terms of the time available at the moment, only that I think it does require quite a bit of rethinking, this idea that the foundation of what he calls natural law can just somehow be read off religious belief. The second general point I wanted to make is this, that given that we've got these values, as he thinks we must have, however kind of implicit or even hidden they are, given that we've got these values, we have to find a way of determining what the value actually requires. So we might all agree, for example, that in terms of a basic stopping point, that murder is wrong. That if somebody justifies what he's doing and that involves murdering somebody, that the wrongness of murder would be a stopping point. But of course, that raises a range of questions. What about capital punishment? What about killing in war? What about euthanasia, a big issue presently in the House of Lords, and so forth? What about, what counts as murder? Well, this is where Temple's idea of dialectic comes in, and in particular the idea of middle range sort of principles and axioms and so forth. And this is remarkably like as a process, as a method, if you like, for moral thinking. It's remarkably like that used by John Rawls, the famous American philosopher, in his book, A Theory of Justice. Rawls doesn't call it dialectic, he calls it reflective equilibrium. And reflective equilibrium, or dialectic in Temple, is the idea that we can affirm certain kinds of values, but in affirming those values or principles, we have to be open to the idea of testing what we think the operation of those principles would be like against our own experience. And that may lead us to modify, in one way or another, the principle, but equally we might want to use the principle to provide a critique of our experience and how we categorize and so forth our experience. So that idea that, you can't just read off from a natural law value in Temple's view what we should or shouldn't do. We have to have some principle derived from that natural law value, but it can be used as in this kind of dialectic between theory and practice, if you like, or value and experience. We can find a way of arriving at a consensual, perhaps, a consensual agreement, a balance, or what Rawls calls a reflective equilibrium between our values and our experience, or between values and policy. And I think that's a very important part of what his argument is. And then finally, and I'll stop after this point, what does Temple mean by the common good, which is something that he's often associated with in his writings? Well, I think it's a very interesting idea, and again, it cuts him off from, intentionally cuts him off from an individualistic view of the common good, where the common good is just an aggregation of individual goods. But rather, for Temple, the common good is to be found and here he follows T.H. Green, the 19th century British philosopher. He argues that the common good is to be found in a sphere that is neither subject to the market nor is subject to rights and entitlements. For the individualist, the only kind of common good, if there is one, is this system of shared values that define what a threat is, for reasons that I've given. But for Temple, it has to be much more than that. And it's associated, in his mind, with the Christian idea of love and how love can actually influence our understanding of public policy. And you may say, well, this is all very, very vague and wishy-washy, but it isn't really. If you think of, well, what sorts of values, what sorts of things that we value are subject neither to the market nor to rights, then love is the obvious one. Because in love, you cannot buy and sell love, because if you do, you destroy it. You would lose immediately whatever it is that you're trying to sell love for. You would lose love at precisely that moment if it's made a subject to price, value, competition, and so forth. But equally, love is lost if we see it purely in terms of rights. Because, how could I have a right to be loved? How would you enforce the right to be loved? It's just impossible. And if I am subject to being forced by the law to love somebody, then love has disappeared. That there are all these values around the idea of love, like compassion, like respect, and so forth, as well as love itself in the Christian understanding of love. There are those aspects which can neither be traded in a market, nor can they be made subject of rights, because if you do these things, you will completely lose what it is precisely you're trying to protect. So for Temple, the Christian idea of love has this position of necessarily being part of the common good because it's neither competitive in a market nor is it segmented up into individual entitlements, which lots of other things can be, and lots of other things can be made subject to markets. But what Temple is clear about is that love can't be either of those things, and love can form the basis of justifying various aspects of life and policy. But in doing so, you've got to recognize that it is not a matter of markets or entitlement, and that's why I think his view of the common good is still quite, has some kind of cutting edge to it. So I'll leave it there, and perhaps one or two of the other issues that I might have mentioned will come up in discussion. Okay?